Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Matson. This PowerPoint will review opioids, a little bit of the history, and where the drug comes from. Opium is a unique substance. This juice from the plant Papaver somniferum has a history of medical use, perhaps 6,000 years ago, or 6,000 years long, excuse me. Opium relieved pain and suffering magnificently. Just as important in the years gone by was its ability to reduce the diarrhea and subsequent dehydration caused by dysentery, which is still a major cause of death in some less developed countries. The most likely origin of opium is in a hot, dry Middle Eastern country. Several millennia ago, when someone discovered that for 7 to 10 days of its year-long life, the Papaver somniferum produced a substance that, when eaten, produced euphoria, and that eased pain and suffering. Opium is produced and available for collection for only a few days of the plant's life, between the time that the petals drop and the seed pod matures. Today, as before, opium harvesters move through the fields in the early evening and use a sharp clawed tool to make shallow cuts into, but not through, the unripe seed pods. During the night, a white substance oozes from the cuts, oxidizes to a red-brown color, and becomes gummy. In the morning, the substance is carefully scraped from the pod and collected in small balls. This raw opium forms the basis for the opium medicines that have been used throughout history and is the substance from which morphine is extracted and then heroin is derived. The importance and extent of the use of the opium poppy in the early Egyptian and Greek cultures are still under debate, but in the Ebers Papyrus, which is circa 1500 BC, a remedy is mentioned to prevent the excessive crying of children. Because a later Egyptian remedy for the same purpose clearly contained opium as well as fly excrement. Many writers report the first specific medical use of the opium as dating from the Ebers Papyrus. Opium was important in Greek medicine, and so Greek and Roman knowledge of opium use in medicine languished during the Middle Ages, and that had little influence on the world's use of opium for the next 1,000 years. In the Arabic world, opium use was prominent because the Quran forbade the use of alcohol in any form. Opium and hashish became the primary social drugs wherever the Islamic culture moved, and it did move. While Europe rested through the early Middle Ages, the Arabian world reached out and made contact with India and China. So shortly after AD 1000, uh, Biruni composed a pharmacology book, and his descriptions of opium contained what some believe to be the first written description of opioid addiction. In the same period, the best known Arabic physician Avicenna was using opium preparations quite extensively in his medical practice, and his writings, along with those of Galen, formed the basis of the medical education in Europe as the Renaissance dawned and the glories of opium had advanced. Early in the 16th century, Paracelsus was a successful clinician and accomplished some wondrous cures for the day. One of his secrets was an opium extract called laudanum. Several famous English authors wrote about the joys of opium, including Elizabeth Barrett, Browning, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And Coleridge's beautiful Kubla Khan is believed to have been conceived and partially composed in an opium reverie. Tobacco smoking spread much more rapidly after its introduction. So in 1729, China's first law against opium smoking mandated that opium shop owners be strangled. Once opium for non medical purposes was outlawed, it was necessary for the drug to be smuggled in form from India, where poppy plantations were abundant. And the background to the Opium Wars is lengthy and complex, but this can help explain why the British went to war so that they can continue pouring opium into China against the wishes of the Chinese national government. And so in 1839, the Emperor of China made a fatal mistake and he sent an honest man to Canton to suppress the opium smuggling. After some haggling, the representative of the British government ordered the merchants to deliver the opium, 20,000 chests worth, about 6 million, which was then destroyed, and everyone was set free. Pressures mounted, and an incident involving drunken American and British sailors killing a Chinese citizen is what started the Opium War in 1839. The British Army arrived 10 months later, and in 2 years, largely by avoiding land battles and by using the superior artillery of the Royal Navy ships, they won a victory over a country of more than 350 million citizens. As victors, the British were given the island of Hong Kong, broad trading rights, and 6 million to reimburse the merchants whose opium had been destroyed. In 1806, Frederick Sir Turner published a report of more than 50 experiments, which clearly showed that he had isolated the primary active ingredient in opium, and the active agent was 10 times as potent as opium. Sir Turner named it morphium after Morpheus, the god of dreams. And use of the new agent developed slowly, but by 1831, the implications of his chemical work and the medical value of morphine had become so overwhelming that he was awarded the French equivalent of the Nobel Prize. Later work into the mysteries of opium found more than 30 different alkaloids, which, with the second most important one being isolated in 1832 and named codeine, which is the Greek word for poppy head. The availability of a clinically useful pure chemical of known potency is often capitalized on in medicine. And so the technological development was the perfection of the hypodermic syringe in 1853 by Dr. Alexander Wood. This made it possible to deliver morphine directly into the blood or the tissue rather than by the much slower process of eating opium or morphine and waiting for absorption to occur from the gastro tract. Morphine was given by injection, worked rapidly, and it was administered regularly in large doses to many soldiers for the reduction of pain and relief from dysentery. The percentage of veterans returning from these wars who were dependent on morphine was high enough that the illness was later called soldier's disease or the army's disease. Toward the end of the 19th century, a small but important chemical transformation was made to the morphine molecule. In 1874, two acetyl groups were attached to morphine, yielding diacetylmorphine, which was given the brand named heroin and placed on the market in 1898 by Bayer Laboratories. The chemical change was important because heroin is about 3 times as potent as morphine. The pharmacology of heroin and morphine is identical, except that the two acetyl groups increased the lipid solubility of the heroin molecule, and the molecule enters the brain slightly faster. Heroin was originally marketed as a non-addictive cough suppressant that would replace morphine and codeine. In the second half of the 19th century, 3 forms of opioid addiction were developing in the U.S. The long, useful oral intake of opium, and then morphine, increased greatly as patent medicines became a standard form of self-medication. After 1850, Chinese laborers were imported in large numbers to the West Coast, and they introduced opium smoking to this country. The last form, medically the most dangerous, was the injection of morphine. And around the start of the 20th century, the percentage of Americans who used one of the opioids on a regular basis was probably greater than at any other time before or since. Several authorities, both then and more recently, agree that no less than 1% of the population was addicted to opioids, although accurate statistics are not available for that. The opium smoking the Chinese brought to this country never became widely popular, although about 1/4 of the opium imported was smoking opium at the start of the 20th century. Patent medicines promised and in part delivered symptom relief. They were easily available, not too expensive, socially acceptable, and they worked. In the late 19th century, regular opioid use was viewed as a vice of middle life. So the typical opioid user of this period was a 30 to 50-year-old white woman who functioned well and adjusted to her life as a wife and a mother. In 1915, the U.S. Supreme Court decided that possession of smuggled opioids was a crime, and users not obtaining the drug from a physician became criminals. Addicted users could still obtain their supply of drugs on a prescription from a physician until the Supreme Court removed this in 1919 and 1922. Even though the Lindner case in 1925 reversed these earlier decisions and stated that a physician could prescribe drugs to non hospitalized users to aid in their treatment, the doctors had been harassed and arrested enough, and so few would do so. Clinics for the treatment of opioid addictions were closed during the 1920s under pressure from federal officials. So the number of oral opioid users began to decline in response to these pressures, and the primary remaining group were those who injected morphine or heroin. By 1922, about the only source of opioids for a non hospitalized abuser was an illegal dealer. Heroin was the most potent opioid available. It was the easiest to conceal and therefore became the illegal dealer's choice. The cost through this source was 30 to 50 times the price of the same drug through legitimate sources, which were no longer available to people who suffered from opioid addiction. Because of this cost, users wanted to be certain to get the most bang for their buck, and so the intravenous injection became more common. During this period, law enforcement agencies and the popular press were instrumental in creating a narrative that changed many American attitudes toward the illicit opioid users. Sometime during the 1920s, the general public became even less tolerant of people with drug addictions, and instead of being viewed as unfortunate victims deserving sympathy and medical assistance, illicit opioid users were now viewed as degenerates and criminals. And the law enforcement approach became the primary means of addressing drug addiction. After the Harrison Act, the number of white middle aged people using opioids orally declined, and in the early years after World War II, heroin use was increasingly spotlighted in the lower class areas of large cities. In the 1960s, the use of various drugs skyrocketed, and then we had the flower children, the hippies, Tim Leary, and LSD received most of the media attention. But within the central core of the large American cities, heroin users slowly began to capture the attention of the authorities, but not in a good way. The white majority expressed little patience or tolerance for people who were addicted to or sold heroin. In fact, this view fueled the passage of New York State's infamous Rockefeller drug laws in 1973. These laws created mandatory minimum prison sentences of 15 years to life for possession of 4 ounces of drugs, such as heroin. And this earned New York the distinction of having the strictest drug laws in the nation. More than 90% of the individuals convicted under these laws were either Black or Latino, prompting calls for reform because of selective enforcement and prosecution. It would take 36 years to get rid of the Rockefeller laws, and in 2009, legislation was passed to eliminate the harsh sentences imposed by the previous set of laws. Toward the end of the 1960s, the public became increasingly anxious about the power of heroin addiction when reports began to filter out of Southeast Asia, suggesting that thousands of Americans, soldiers fighting in the Vietnam Wars, were regular users. Heroin was about 95% pure and sold almost openly in South Vietnam, whereas purity in the United States was about 5% in 1969. The high purity of the heroin made it possible to obtain psychological effects by smoking or sniffing the drug. This fact, coupled with the erroneous belief that addiction occurs only when the drug is used intravenously, resulted in about 40% of the users sniffing and about half smoking and only 10% injecting the heroin. An excellent follow-up study of veterans who returned from Vietnam in September of 1971 showed that most of the Vietnam heroin users did not continue to use heroin in this country. One of the important lessons learned from this experience is that heroin addiction and compulsive use are not inevitable among occasional users. In 1972, the major source of U.S. heroin was opium grown in Turkey and converted into heroin in southern French port cities such as Marseilles. In 1975, the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, estimated that 80% or more of all U.S. heroin was from Mexico, and sometimes referred to as Mexican brown or black tar. In the late 20th century, about half of the U.S. heroin supply apparently originated in Southwest Asia, like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran. Mexico was the next biggest contributor, with the Golden Triangle area of Southeast Asia, which is Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand, producing about 15 to 20% of the total. Increased production in Mexico and South America has resulted in both greater availability and greater purity in the U.S. market. And from the mid 1970s through the mid 80s, the average purity varied from 4 to 6% heroin. Today, heroin purity can and does vary widely. For example, at the street level, the average purity is about 35%, while wholesale purities range between 51 and 83%. The price of a bag has not changed so much, so the price per milligram of actual heroin is down. One concern with street heroin is the larger proportion now contains fentanyl, which is a potent synthetic opioid that is used to medically treat severe pain. And some illicit manufacturers of heroin and dealers add fentanyl to the heroin supply as a means of saving money and stretching their product. This practice can be problematic, even fatal for the unsuspecting consumer when they ingest too much of the substance thinking that it is heroin alone. The most popular prescription opioids are various brands of hydrocodone like Vicodin or Lortab, and oxycodone or Oxycontin and Percocet. These are mostly taken orally, but when used recreationally, they're sometimes snorted or injected. In 2018, 1% of Americans aged 12 and older reported non-medical use of a prescription pain reliever within the past month. Chronic pain is a condition that can negatively impact an individual's quality of life by disrupting sleep, employment, social functioning, and other routine activities. An estimated 50 million adults in the U.S. have symptoms of chronic pain, and opioids remain the most effective treatment. But periodic high-profile deaths of celebrities and reports of pill mills reignited concerns about physicians overprescribing opioid pain medications. Raw opium contains about 10% morphine by weight and a smaller amount of codeine. The addition of the two acetyl groups to the morphine molecule results in the diacetylmorphine or heroin. The acetyl group allows heroin to penetrate the blood-brain barrier more readily, and heroin is slightly more potent than morphine. Medicinal chemists have worked hard over the decades to produce compounds that would be effective painkillers, trying to separate the analgesic effect of the opioids from their dependence-producing effects. In addition to the opioid analgesics, the search for new compounds led to the discovery of the opioid antagonists and drugs that block the action of morphine, heroin, or other opioid agonists. The administration of a drug such as naloxone or Narcan can save a person's life by reversing the depressed respiration resulting from the opioid overdose. And if given to an individual who's been taking opioids and who has become physically dependent, these antagonists can precipitate an immediate withdrawal syndrome. Both naloxone and the longer-lasting naltrexone have been given to dependent individuals to prevent them from experiencing a high if they use heroin. The finding that opioid receptors exist in the membrane of some neurons led to an obvious question. What are opioid receptors doing in the synapses of the brain? Waiting for someone to extract the juice from a poppy? Scientists all over the world went to work looking for a substance in the brain that could serve as the natural activator of these opioid receptors. Groups in England and Sweden succeeded in 1974, and a pair of molecules were isolated from brain extracts. They acted like morphine and were many times more potent. And then came the discovery of the endorphins that are also found in the brain tissue and have potent opioid effects. These substances, as well as the natural and synthetic opioid drugs, have actions on at least 3 types of opioid receptors, and these were discovered in the 1990s. The major therapeutic indication for morphine and other opioids is the reduction of pain. After the administration of the analgesic dose of morphine, some patients report that they are still aware of pain, but the pain is no longer aversive. The opioids seem to have their effect in part by diminishing the patient's awareness of and response to the aversive stimulus, although one of the characteristics of these drugs is their ability to reduce pain without inducing sleep. Drowsiness is not uncommon after a therapeutic dose. Opioids have long been valued for their effect on the gastrosystem. They quiet the colic and save lives by counteracting diarrhea. Particularly in the young and the elderly, diarrhea and resulting dehydration can be a major cause of death. And opioid drugs decrease the number of the peristaltic contractions, which is a type of contraction responsible for moving food through the intestines. Although modern synthetic opioids are now sold for this purpose, old-fashioned, opium solutions are still available for the symptomatic relief of diarrhea. The opioids also have the effect of decreasing activity in what the advertisers refer to as the cough control center in the medulla. Since it was first purified from opium, codeine has been widely used for its antitussive properties and is still available in a number of prescription cough remedies. Non-prescription cough remedies contain the dextromorphorin, an opioid analog that is somewhat more selective in its antitussive effects. Tolerance develops to most of the effects of the opioids, although with different effects, tolerance can occur at different rates. If the drug is used chronically for pain relief, for example, it'll probably be necessary to increase the dose to maintain a constant effect. Cross tolerance exists among all the opioids. The development of tolerance to opioid-related effects is usually discussed as a negative consequence of drug use. There is, however, a potential benefit of developing tolerance to opioids. Regular opioid users who have developed tolerance are less likely to experience opioid-induced respiratory depression at doses that may be harmful to infrequent users of opioids. In a person who has used the drug chronically at high doses, as each dose begins to wear off, certain withdrawal symptoms begin to appear. Combine nausea and vomiting with diarrhea, aches, pains, and a general sense of misery, and one has a pretty good idea of what a moderate case of opioid withdrawal is like. Rarely life-threatening, but most unpleasant. Note that methadone is a long-lasting synthetic opioid that produces withdrawal symptoms that are usually less severe and that appear later than with the heroin, but they may last longer. Wrapping it up here with the toxicity potential, one specific effect of the opioids is to depress the respiratory centers in the brain so that respiration slows and becomes shallow. Most opioid overdoses involve multiple substances. A large fraction of those who die from heroin overdose have elevated blood alcohol concentrations and might better be described as dying from a combination of heroin and alcohol or some other opioid. This makes it difficult to attribute the death to a single opioid. Still, opioid overdose can be diagnosed on the basis of the opioid triad: coma, depressed respiration, and pinpoint pupils. Early in the 20th century, many medical authorities believed that chronic opioid use weakened the user both mentally and physically. There's no scientific evidence that exposure to opioid drugs per se causes long-term damage to any tissue or organ system. Also, the practice of sharing needles can result in the spread of bloodborne diseases such as hepatitis and HIV. Some users report that when they try with every injection to re experience the extreme euphoria of the first injection, but always have a lesser effect. However, studies as well as clinical street reports show that many people experience nausea and discomfort after administration of morphine or heroin, especially if large doses are administered. Despite this, some of these users persist and the discomfort decreases. That is, it shows that tolerance more rapidly than the euphoric effects. Another misconception that has to do with development of withdrawal symptoms is for many users, the withdrawal symptoms resemble a mild case of intestinal flu, such as cramps, diarrhea, headache, lethargy. Perhaps the most common misconception about heroin is that after one shot, one is hooked for life. The truth is, most opioid users do not become addicted. Less than one third of heroin users and less than one tenth of people prescribed opioids for pain will meet criteria for an opioid use disorder.